we have in Australia and are used in other places, sometimes around the world in places. The rationale for establishing thresholds because inadvertent presence is considered unavoidable. We were told when this stuff was coming in Australia that we could have coexistence. We could have GM and non-GM side by side. Then we were told for that to happen we had to accept 0.9% contamination. So how much dodgy beer do you want in your glass of Glenfiddich whiskey? Effectively, this is what we're doing. So that rain event wasn't that common in Australia, but it is inevitable. It happens every few years. What about outside of that? What chances of contamination? Now this is a photograph that's been covered up by a little funny square of a canola crop growing and flowering on its own. This is called a volunteer plant. It's growing where we haven't actually planted canola. Nothing extraordinary, it's very common, happens all over the place in our canola growing areas. The problem is, the land that plant is on is the Horsham Plant Research Farm. The sheds in the background are where they keep their equipment and do their work. This is run by scientists, run by researchers, best practice. And we've got volunteer canola growing and flowering, and at that stage it will have viable pods on it. This is canola flowering a bean crop. Now whether it's GM or not, I'm not sure. It's actually quite close to a known GM grower, or GE grower. There isn't really a chemical option for taking canola out of beans, so this will almost certainly set pods of seed. If it's GM, what chance of contamination? Pollen will also flow 5 kilometres from this stuff. And canola it's got the morals of an alley cat. It crosses out all over the place within the brassica world. This is a photograph showing the road, up in the corner of the shot is actually the road from Melbourne to Adelaide. To the left is the railway line from Melbourne to Adelaide, and the yellow flowers are canola flowering on the side of the road. Just over the railway line is a major grain receival centre, and over the rise in front of us is what's now called Grains Innovation Park, formerly Victorian Institute of Dryland Agriculture, prior to that the Wheat Research Institute, one of the major plant breeding centres in Australia, and in fact a hotbed of GM research. This is where some of the research for GM ryegrass for your country is being done. The bulk of it's being done a bit south of here at a place called Hamilton in Victoria, and I think there's some happening in Sydney and there's still some happening here for GE ryegrass for your country. So what future with GM crops? Because the GM industry are claiming all sorts of wonderful things that they can do. So we can have GM free food because they said we can have coexistence. We can have GM food. We can have GM pharmaceuticals. You've seen the cows, we can do it for plants, is the claim. Or we can even do GM industrial where the plants produce plastics. So, contamination is inevitable. Cannot be avoided. And that's been demonstrated time and time and time again. What hasn't been demonstrated is that you can avoid contamination. So we get a case where we've got these different classes of GM material floating around the world. So straight away, GM-free food, being supreme in Auckland, been pinged for 0.0088. We can't grow GM-free food because it's going to be contaminated.
That's what Monsanto wants, isn't it? Because they don't want the competition of organic food.
We'll get to that in a minute. There's a bit more stuff that's a little bit scary too. Now, if we've got GM pharmaceuticals growing, and we're going to have this inevitable contamination, how popular do you think it'd be to have a bit of Viagra in the scones at the church fete? Or would you like some plastics in your pills? There's a possibility, if we take this to contamination to the extreme, that farmers might not be able to produce food. Western Australia, it's the other side of Australia, did a bit of an appraisal of what the commercial release of GM canola could cost that state. 12.25 billion a year, and it would affect honey, poultry, feed, grains, and so on and so forth. Because there's another level of this contamination as well. There's at this point no commercially released wheat in Australia, but what if I've got GM canola mixed in a bit in my wheat crop, in the wheat I deliver? Is that wheat contaminated with GM? Of course it is. So it's not within the species, it's also across the species. So in Australia, pre-release we were told there'd be higher yields, better returns, this stuff would nearly shear your sheep as they walk past. Afterwards we found out there is little agronomic benefit. The two traits that we've got in GE at the moment is Roundup Ready and BT, an insecticide that's expressed throughout the plant. That's it, 30 years of research and that's what we've got on the market. No economic benefit. The cost of the seed, the cost of the user, technology user agreement, there's a stack of things that are involved. Added to lower price you get for GE product, you actually make less money. There's no economic benefit. We were told prior to release that this is fine, we can have coexistence, everything will be good, it's going to be wonderful and help agriculture enormously. Contamination is inevitable. Market rejection and penalties associated with GM and contamination up to $50 a tonne in canola. At the moment it's about $35 a tonne in Australia if you can sell your GM canola. And there's an organic farmer, Steve Marsh in Western Australia, lost his organic certification because his neighbour's GE canola was blown onto his place, certification gone, value of his wheat reduced to about a third of what it was worth as organic. He expects, even if he wins the court case that's currently in process, to lose his farm anyway. No risk management. We're promised there'd be no problem. Contamination's good. We've got protocols. Everything's going to be hunky-dory. We've got strict liability. We don't have liability, but that'll be sorted out in the courts. So, liability is unresolved. We don't know who's up for economic loss, except it is the non-GM grower. We've now established that. Neighbour disputes. I'll mention that shortly. Shire responsibility. In West Australia, the brakes on a truck caught on fire, burnt a hole in the back of the truck, left a trail of canola for several kilometres along the road. Local government carried the cost.
So Shire.
The Shire.
Council.
Yeah, Shire Council carried the cost of the clean-up. Unfair liability is non-GM farmers are liable for proving non-GM status. Now in Australia, if we want to sell non-GM canola, we have to be prepared to prove it's non-GM. The 0.9% is legally accepted, but if you go to your market and say, I want to sell you non-GM canola, they say, good, it's got none in it, has it? And we say, oh, put out 0.9, then it's not GM free. This is a little cartoon I found in one of the papers in Australia a while ago, and I think it sums up the GM issue beautifully. Quite suddenly all the good ideas have been used up. Well, actually, not so much as used up as badly used, misused and abused, in fact, to the point where they didn't work. The good ideas have become dysfunctional, they've broken down. So the world turned to bad ideas, of which there was a cheap and plentiful supply. We'll soon realise that bad ideas cannot be ruined or abused because they are awful to begin with. So the world set to work putting them into practice. Sustainability had come to the earth at last. So in Australia, why do we have the circumstance we have? Well, there were basically four groups that were involved in setting up our current system in Australia on GE. We have the biotech companies, and this particular one is just the flagship. There's half a dozen of them. And really, they're just doing what any business will do, trying to make the biggest buck for the minimum effort. So they're trying to establish their profit, their security into the future, and that's what businesses do. We have the official part, the government. In this case, we've got the Office of Gene Technology Regulator, OGTR, which we have in Australia, who is responsible for approving the release of various GE products and so on. We have the farmer representation groups, in this case the VFF, Victorian Farmers Federation, our equivalent of your Federated Farmers. And we have the scientific institutions. Now, in my view, both the Office of Gene Technology Regulator and the farmer representative groups absolutely failed us in Victoria. They in fact promoted the adoption of GE over the protests in the case of the VFF, and I was a member at the time this was coming through, they just basically overruled us and said, forget it, you haven't got a view that's worth listening to. OGTR, we now have court cases, for example, Steve Marsh, trying to sort out the mess they've left. So the farmers are exposed to liability, and we have customers who don't really have confidence in what they're buying. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine put out this letter, and I've highlighted a couple of points on it. Safety assessment of GM foods has been based on the idea of substantial equivalence. You'll probably rarely ever hear this term, but this is what's behind the regulation of the release of this material, this GE stuff. If a new food is found to be substantially equivalent in composition and nutritional characteristics to an existing food, it can be regarded as safe. The second little yellow bit I just thought was interesting, so I highlighted it. The principle of substantial equivalence is an alibi with no scientific basis created out of thin air to prevent GMOs, in your term GEs, from being considered at least as food additives, and this enabled biotech companies to avoid toxicological tests provided for in the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, US term, to avoid labelling of their products. Nice little bureaucratic thing. It has no scientific basis. It's a bureaucratic term, but it provides a very powerful mechanism for sliding stuff through regulation. It's a double standard because this biotech stuff, these GE products, are similar enough to slide into the food supply without testing or labelling in many, many countries. And we get told in Australia that our labelling is good. It's pretty dodgy. There's loopholes all through it. But it's different enough to require a technology use contract with the owner of the patent. You may not keep your seed for resowing. You have to buy new seed every year, and it's expensive. And if you don't comply with these rules, you get hammered. It is quite common for farmers in the US to lose their farm. Another thing that's happened in Australia is we have devalued science. Now, there's some really good scientists out there. But they're now working in a world where if they want to act as science, they have to sell their skills to these sort of companies. So now, when we see our politician or our biotech rep standing up saying, we're doing this and it's based on good science, it's a political or a sales pitch. It is not a scientific claim or standard. We treat the data with suspicion because we assume now it's skewed in favour of whoever has funded the research. And the biggest thing, now this bit, who is making this claim, was originally in this presentation who owns a scientist, but before I flew over here I actually spent, I stayed with some friends in Melbourne who are both doctors of astrophysics, PhDs in astrophysics, very clever scientists, very good mathematicians. They were offended by the concept that someone might own a scientist. So I've changed it out of respect for them, but I'll put the thing on it, science is paying a price in credibility for the actions of marketers and financiers. Now when I presented this down in Ashburton for the beekeepers, there was a scientist sitting in the audience just in front of me, and I said, is that right, Craig? And he said yes. Science is being devalued, and previously respected institutions and research and unis are also being devalued. Some of our institutions in Australia are now basically theme parks for biotech companies, including the one near home. So who